The hum of the air conditioning was the only heartbeat in the room. For Elias, a 35-year-old senior analyst, life had become a series of spreadsheets and fluorescent lights. Outside his high-rise office, the metropolis stretched out like a grey labyrinth, a concrete ocean where souls rushed toward destinations they couldn't remember. Elias stared at his reflection in the dark monitor. He had reached 35, the age his father called the midpoint of relevance, yet he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He had followed every rule, secured a modern apartment, and earned the status society demanded, but the silence inside those walls was deafening. He had wealth and a title, but his heart felt like a hollowed tree, standing tall but rotting from within. The interruption came as a sharp knock. His presence was requested in the executive boardroom. As Elias walked down the carpeted hallway, his pulse remained flat. This was the high-stakes board meeting he had worked a decade to reach. Inside, the CEO gestured to a leather chair. They were offering him the senior vice presidency, a promotion that would triple his salary and cement his status. But as the CEO spoke of synergy, the room began to shrink. Elias didn't see a milestone, he saw a gilded cage. Suddenly, the sterile air was replaced by the phantom scent of his father's old tobacco. He remembered the man who had withered under paper promises. Before his heart gave out, his father had whispered, "Never trade your years for a future that doesn't belong to you, son. They'll buy your time, but they will never pay you back for the life you missed." The CEO paused, waiting for the expected "thank you." Instead, a strange calm washed over Elias. He stood up slowly. "I quit," he said, his voice echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The confusion on their faces was a masterpiece of disbelief. Elias turned and walked out, leaving his briefcase on the mahogany table. He walked past the cubicles and out through the glass doors into the afternoon sun. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The weight that had crushed his chest for years simply evaporated. He went to his apartment, packed a single duffel bag with old clothes, and threw his keys onto the counter. He climbed into his car and drove away from the steel towers, toward the north. His destination was a place he hadn't visited in 20 years, a derelict family estate, tucked away in the jagged mountain peaks. It was a property his father had died trying to protect, a place of overgrown gardens and a cabin that leaned precariously against the wind. As the city lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the deep shadows of the forest, Elias felt a flicker of raw, primal fear. The sun had dipped below the horizon when his headlights finally illuminated the rusted iron gates. The driveway was almost invisible, reclaimed by weeds. The air here was thin and cold, biting at his lungs in a way that felt honest. He parked the car and approached the cabin, the old wood groaning under his heavy boots. The structure looked like a tomb, forgotten by time and reclaimed by the wilderness. But as he reached for the rusted door handle, something white caught his eye. Pinned to the rough-hewn wood was a fresh, crisp envelope. It hadn't been there long. The paper was perfectly dry, despite the mountain mist. With trembling fingers, Elias pulled the note free and read the handwritten words that sent a chill through his veins. "You shouldn't have come back. The debt is still unpaid." He looked around at the dark, whispering trees, realizing that his escape from the corporate machine had led him into a different kind of trap. The silence of the mountains was no longer peaceful. It was a warning. The past he thought he had buried was waiting for him. The first week was a brutal education in physics and patience. Elias swapped his tailored suits for heavy flannel and work boots that bit into his ankles with every step. Every morning, the mountain air was a cold slap to his face, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled sterility he had left behind. He spent hours chopping wood, his palms blistering before finally turning into tough shields. Repairing the cabin was more than physical survival. It was a metaphor for his own internal reconstruction. He patched the roof under a bruising grey sky and scrubbed 2 decades of grime from the windows. As the light finally filtered through the clean glass, he felt a strange sense of clarity he had never found in a spreadsheet. One evening, while prying up a rotted floorboard near the stone hearth, Elias's crowbar hit something metallic with a dull thud. Tucked away in a shallow, hand-carved cavity was a rusted tin box containing 3 leather-bound journals. These weren't the ramblings of a man who had lost his mind to the mountain solitude. His father's handwriting was precise, almost clinical, detailing names, dates, and coordinates. The pages revealed a terrifying truth. His father hadn't just left the city for peace. He was hiding from a corporate conspiracy he had uncovered. He had found evidence of massive toxic dumping and illegal land acquisitions by the very conglomerates Elias had spent his career serving. The debt mentioned in the note wasn't about money. It was a legacy of dangerous secrets his father had been unable to carry alone. Despite the discovery, the silence of the mountains began to weigh on him. In the dead of night, when the wind howled through the pines like a choir of ghosts, Elias felt waves of regret and deep loneliness. He missed the hum of the city, the convenience of his old life, and the predictable rhythm of his former routine. He looked at his calloused, dirty hands and wondered if he had ruined his life for a ghost story. He was a man out of time and out of place, caught between a world he hated and a wilderness that didn't yet trust him. The isolation was a mirror, and the reflection he saw was someone he barely recognized. This internal conflict was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black SUV that looked like a predatory insect against the rustic backdrop. Out stepped Silas, a powerful local land developer whose smile didn't reach his eyes. Silas represented everything Elias had just tried to escape: corporate greed wrapped in an expensive suit. He wanted the property to build a luxury resort, seeing the mountain as a series of profitable assets rather than a sanctuary. Silas offered a check that would have restored Elias's former status instantly. But Elias saw the truth behind the charm. Silas was part of the same machine that had drained his father's spirit. The decision to stay was no longer about peace, it was about taking a stand. A growing connection with Clara provided the emotional anchor he desperately needed. As a local veterinarian who had known his father, she was the only person who didn't look at Elias like an interloper. She taught him which plants were medicine and which were poison, showing him that life was defined by community rather than bank balances. Through her stories, Elias realized that his father hadn't been a coward, he had been a guardian. Clara's presence reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of a purpose that went beyond himself. The tension escalated quickly as Silas began to harass him. The cabin's water supply was mysteriously cut, and the fences Elias had spent days repairing were torn down in the night. Shadows lingered at the edge of the woods, a calculated psychological siege designed to break him. But Elias wasn't the same man who had walked out of the boardroom. The fear that used to paralyze him was being replaced by a cold, hard resolve to protect the land his father had died for. Elias finally deciphered a cryptic map in the back of the journal that pointed to a specific location on the property. He spent hours digging beneath the roots of a lightning-scarred oak tree until hitting a locked ancient iron chest. His heart hammered as he cleared the soil, sensing the truth was within reach. But before he could pry the lock open, the silence was shattered by the sound of a car pulling up and a gunshot echoing through the valley. The echo of the gunshot died away, leaving a ringing silence that was quickly filled by the crunch of heavy boots on dry leaves. Elias stayed low, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 3 men emerged from the tree line, their shadows long and jagged in the dying light. Silas walked at the center, his expensive leather shoes now coated in the very mud he sought to pave over for profit. He held a hunting rifle with the casual indifference of a man who believed everything in this world had a price tag. Elias realized then that the debt mentioned in the note wasn't a threat from a ghost, but a warning from the living. Silas didn't just want the land. He wanted the absolute silence that came with its destruction. With a desperate surge of strength, Elias hauled the iron chest from the earth and retreated into the darkening woods. Inside the cabin, with the mountain wind beginning to howl against the logs, Elias smashed the rusted lock with a heavy fire iron. The lid groaned open, revealing a meticulously preserved archive of corporate malice. There were chemical analysis reports showing toxic runoff in the valley's water table, forged land deeds, and photographs of Silas's father standing over scarred earth that should have been protected. This was the burden his father had carried, a map of a crime so vast it had swallowed the local community whole. As Silas's men began to batter at the front door, Elias realized his father hadn't died of simple stress. He had died holding the line. The promotion Elias had walked away from in the city was a hollow joke compared to the weight of the truth sitting in his lap. He was now the final custodian of a stolen mountain legacy. A massive mountain storm broke with a violence that shook the foundations of the cabin. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the world in strobe-like flashes of silver and black. Elias slipped out through a rear window, the journals and the most damning evidence tucked into his waterproof jacket. He climbed toward the jagged cliffside overlooking the valley, the wind trying to tear him from the rock. Silas followed, driven by a desperate greed that blinded him to the danger of the crumbling edge. They met where the earth dropped away into the abyss. Silas screamed over the thunder, demanding the documents, his face a mask of predatory rage. Elias looked at the man and felt a strange sense of pity. Instead of seeking revenge or using violence, Elias held up a digital recorder. He informed Silas that the evidence had already been transmitted to an off-site legal contact Clara had provided. The long game of shadows was over. The truth was already free. The surrender wasn't violent. It was a slow, crushing realization for Silas that his empire was built on shifting sand. Months later, the headlines in the city were filled with the indictment of the land developer and the exposure of decades of environmental crimes. But Elias didn't watch the news. The estate was no longer a tomb, but a bustling center of activity and restoration. With Clara by his side, Elias transformed the property into a protected nature reserve and a community center where local families could finally reclaim their history. He looked at his hands. The soft fingers of an analyst were gone, replaced by skin that was calloused and strong. He had found a wealth that didn't exist in spreadsheets, the feeling of soil that belonged to the future. He was no longer the man who lived for paper promises. He lived for the mountain and its people. The decision he made at 35 hadn't just changed his life. It had saved his soul from a gray, empty existence. Standing on the porch of the restored cabin, Elias looked at a photograph of his father. He finally understood the quiet, knowing smile on the old man's face in those final days. It wasn't the smile of a man who had lost, but of one who knew the truth would eventually find its way home through someone with enough courage to listen. Elias took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, felt the solid weight of his own existence, and whispered to the wind that he was finally home. He had corrected a generational wrong and found his true purpose. His father's long-dormant legacy was finally safe, and his own soul was free. The mountains were no longer a place of exile, but a living testament to a life finally well lived.